Hey everyone! In this episode, I'll be switching things up. Instead of demonstrating watercolor painting, I'll be taking advantage of Tony Foster's artworks from the Grand Canyon in the United States to explore how I might lay out a landscape drawing. This is the underdrawing for a watercolor painting. Spending time on the drawing is often foundational for later creating a successful watercolor piece. If you're following along with this video today, all you'll need is a pencil, an eraser, paper, and your landscape references. So, my general philosophy is that the more time you invest in planning out the composition beforehand, the easier your painting job will be. Pencil outlines define boundaries between and clarify main landscape features, and they help to remove most of the guesswork about where to place washes and brush strokes later. Spending time on a drawing beforehand gives you a sense of what the finished work will look like, and it also inherently forces you to study and become more intimately familiar with the landscape. Many artists practice drawing their subjects with quick studies or sketches for this very reason. Tony Foster generally creates his studies at the same time as his finished work, meaning that he draws directly on the paper that will become his final painting. An exception to this was when he tackled his most ambitious artwork to date in 2013, an almost 4-foot by 7-foot watercolor painting of the Grand Canyon called 23 Days Painting the Canyon from west of Navajo Point. Tony was first encouraged to visit the Grand Canyon decades earlier by his good friend and travel companion Bill Brace, who was a highly acclaimed, world-renowned MIT geologist during his lifetime. When creating Exploring Beauty, Watercolor Diaries from the Wild, Tony Foster nominated the Grand Canyon in Bill Brace's honor so that Brace would be included in the canon of luminaries for this capstone journey. In 2013, Tony Foster actually spent 23 days on site, devoting several days to the graphite drawing alone before starting on the watercolors. Because of the sheer scale and complexity of this landscape, not to mention the amount of time and effort he knew would go into it, Foster found it useful to study certain landscape features separately to ensure he got them just right on the final piece. This graphite sketch is a study trying to sort out a Grand Canyon feature known as Escalante Butte. Let's take a closer look at this drawing. Because this study is a foundation for a future watercolor painting, we don't see much shading, only outlines. These outlines are essentially guidelines to help define edges between different features. Notice also how some lines are darker and others are lighter. Varying line weight like this can help clarify which landscape features are more prominent, closer to us, or farther away. For example, hard, defined edges are dark, whereas softer, less prominent edges are light and less defined. To create our drawing today, we'll be thinking in terms of edges and outlines too. The reference photo I'll be using is this one I took in the Grand Canyon with a bonus prairie dog in the lower right corner. And although we won't be working in color today, it is worth pointing out the immense influence of atmospheric perspective in the far distance of this photo, such a clear example of this phenomenon. The part of the canyon visible becomes progressively more hazy and blue as it recedes into the background. You may use any landscape photo you like for today. The principles of this demonstration will be the same, or follow along with me on this one. If you're working from a real-life landscape, these principles will still be very useful. Alright, grab your pencil and let's get started. Let's begin by studying our landscape a little bit. I like to do this because the more I'm familiarized with the landscape, the easier it is to draw later. Whether you're working out in the field or selecting a photo reference that you're going to be working from, you'll want to think about what makes one landscape more visually appealing, more visually interesting than another one. I've selected mine here because I like the way that your eye gets drawn into the background by these successive layers of canyon wall. But maybe if you're working out in the field and seeing a broad horizon, broad landscape out in front of you, it might feel overwhelming to select one portion. One trick is to focus small. Think about a particular landscape feature that's interesting to you and surround that by a rectangle. Here I'm using a slide mount to create a border that will help me visualize what that landscape portion may look like. If I hold it in different sections like this, I can find lots of areas with visual appeal. But for today I'm going to be working from the entire photograph. In the field, landscapes can be especially overwhelming when you don't know how to contain them and then transfer that vision to the page. See if you can identify markers for yourself that will help contain left, right, top, and down boundaries. With the photo, it's easy because it already has these boundaries, and I can just work from that. But in the field, you'll want to decide, okay, maybe this tree here is going to be my right side boundary, and maybe this little notch on this ledge right here is going to be my left side boundary. But then how much sky do you put in? Do you make the whole frame a square, or do you keep everything relatively squashed and horizontal? Lots of decisions to make, but the more that you can study ahead of time and make these decisions for yourself, the easier time you'll have with the drawing because you'll already know what you want. One other thing I will do to study my landscape is to visualize relationships between different landscape elements. For example, in mine, I've got this very prominent foreground feature here, this piece of the canyon wall that's jutting out at me. I want to see, for example, how high up in this landscape is the top of this ledge compared to, say, this back ledge. Do these 2 points line up? It can be helpful to use a ruler here, but I could also use my pencil to do the same thing and just get a visual sense of how these 2 points line up. So now I know that these 2 points are roughly on the same plane. And when I go to do my drawing, I'll want to make sure that that stays the same. Over here, I want to see how vertical is this wall. Is there a bit of an angle to it, or is it really indeed vertical? I can use the side of the photograph here as a bit of a measure and then hold my pencil parallel to that just to see, okay, so we have a little bit sticking out on this side. That's good to know. Next, how far down from the top does my sky come down before it hits the horizon line? So I've got my horizon right here. And visually, if I use the left side of my rectangle in my photo, I can estimate that there's about a quarter of sky here. If this is 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. So when I go to do my drawing, I'll want to make sure that that is the same, that I've got about a quarter of sky in my drawing and that it's not larger or smaller than that. This giant blue section here, how far up is it along my left side? I would estimate that it's just over a third if I can divide this left margin into thirds. So again, when I go to do my drawing, I'll know that this blue section should be just over a third. Spending a little time looking at the landscape like this really helps, just to get you familiar with what you're going to be creating when you put your pencil down to the paper. A lot of times, experienced artists may do these kinds of calculations subconsciously as they're looking at the landscape. But if you're a beginner especially, take a little time and force yourself to really look carefully like this, because it'll result in a lot more success for your final piece. And if you're working out in the field, some of these same principles apply. Hold your pencil out in front of you and use the straight edge as a way to measure different landscape proportions, the same way we were doing with a photograph, pretending that the pencil edge is roughly the same as your boundary on either left, right, top, or bottom. How far down are you going to want your sky to come in your rectangle? Do you want it to come halfway? Do you want it to come a quarter? You get to make those decisions. Okay, so now we'll get started with the drawing. I'll recommend starting out with a loose rectangle to help you define your boundaries. If you're more experienced, you can definitely just begin by drawing in the landscape features one by one and growing your landscape out as it goes. But as a beginner, the constraints really help. So you can do this with or without a ruler. I'm just going to be very loose and create my boundaries like so. And again, this can be loose. Next, I'm going to try to create a very general map of sorts, guidelines that will serve to block out the different proportions of all the elements in my landscape. So for example, I will start a quarter down from the top, roughly, and know that this is where my sky falls. I can see here that I'm just under half for the point where this rock face juts out. So here's my halfway point, just a little over, roughly where this rock face juts out. Over here, very loose, is where my prominent rock face feature is going to be jutting out that contains the prairie dog. And then at the very top, kind of as a diagonal, this canyon wall here will slide across the entire rectangle. So I'm going to follow that shape roughly. And as I start blocking out these shapes, being very light and very loose, I'm going to carefully start increasing the amount of detail as well. Just over a third up. And it looks like I'm thinking I placed my sky a little too far down, so I'm going to move that up here. And just erase this previous line. I'll look at this shape here, kind of a triangle of sorts, and make sure that it matches proportionally what I'm drawing here. Little divot right there. And then I can add in this little element in between. Again, as a loose shape for now. We got a bit of a mountain coming down this way that fades off, so the edge, the line should taper off as well. Somewhere around here, coming down and fading. Let's focus on this line some more. I can see that the top of this little mesa here is roughly on the same plane as the top of this little nub right here, maybe a little under, and so I'll make sure that that's the same here. Make my mark. Continue to build this down, paying attention to this giant dark blue shape and making sure that I'm creating something equivalent here. Let's focus on this edge right here, which is strongest, it's sharpest right in the middle around this area, but then down here and up here we kind of lose it a bit. Something like that. And now I jump into this more vertical face, remembering that it's not perfectly vertical. But because I mapped it out ahead of time, I know that I'm in the right place now. And then finally, let's do this shape here. I've got my loose guideline for it. And over here, if this is my halfway point, I know I'm under that. So again, here's my halfway point. Here's under that. Great, this is where my ledge can begin. Roughly horizontal. Tip around there. Paying attention to angles in the rock. So this angle here, making sure it's the same as this angle here. And then I'll place my prairie dog in roughly where it goes. little shape right here. Continue to build out the canyon walls a bit. Got this feature here. And I'll say at this point I have my major landscape elements mapped out. So this is a very loose mapping. I'm making sure that the proportions are as I want them. I'm making sure that I understand where all the major areas are. And then now at this stage I can start to lay in more detail and start to clarify some of these loose lines, erasing the ones that are extraneous and reinforcing the ones that ought to be very clear and sharp. So these front ones are especially crisp. So I'm going to come in with a clean line, darker line, and just start refining these. I'm spending a lot of time, a lot more time with my eyes staring at the reference photo than I am at the actual drawing. And over time, I'm gathering more information by studying where each of these lines is going, because they correspond to an edge of some feature of this landscape. So clarifying and cleaning up. Ultimately, this is your drawing, right? This is your interpretation of a landscape, turning it from a 3D thing that you're seeing into a 2D rendition on the paper. So a drawing is an interpretation, and you get to use as much artistic license as you like in creating this. All the little imperfections that come across in the end will make it more your own. And the goal is not to 100% copy the landscape, but to interpret the landscape as a drawing. And as an artist, you're making a lot of little mental calculations about what details to include, what details to omit, how to best represent the vision of what you want, which in my case is, again, leading the eye into the distance here and creating visual interest in this piece, but also giving myself a good guideline for watercolor. So it doesn't have to be exactly like what you're seeing. It just should be based off of that. And you can also see that this could take hours and hours and hours. If you wanted to, you could go into all the little details in here. And, you know, especially if this photo reference were larger, I could probably get more detailed and see more information there that I could translate to my page. For the purposes of today, I just want to create something simple to be done in the next 30 minutes or so. And so I'm not going to go all that detailed. And as a watercolor painter, you get to choose as well how much you want to render with the pencil versus how much you want to add later with the watercolor. It's helpful to have the pencil, of course, as the guideline, but that doesn't mean that the entire thing needs to be rendered beforehand. You can leave some to when you're using the watercolor paints and figure it out at that stage. Okay, just reinforcing some of these darks here to really bring this forward. This is a very sharp, defined edge, and I want to reinforce that. Same down here. Okay. And now I get to move over to this area. And add my vegetation. There we go. And now up here. You see how useful it is to have these guidelines, because even though they're not exact, they give me a good frame of reference so that I don't get overly focused in on these details and stop paying attention to other important drawing aspects like proportions. You know, I figured all that out beforehand with the loose sketch, and so now I just get to lay some of these details over without having to worry as much. All right, I'm going to start here now. A little lighter with my pencil. Do some sighting, some guideline viewing. Clean this up. And again, trying as much as possible to look at the reference photo rather than at what I'm drawing. You know, I'm going to trust my hand and my pencil to make the mark correctly, but I'm going to be following my eye as my eye moves across these edges, just moving at the same rate. Adding in some of these finer lines give me a sense of what's going on internally within this giant piece of canyon face. And also, I'm going to start giving myself a little bit of a sense of these dark patches, because that'll be good guidelines for my watercolor later. Even just the outline of that shape will be super useful. Some of these facets, these sharp facets. And then over here, these lines, the layers in the rock are useful guidelines. So I'm going to start laying some of these in. Get the vegetation in here and some of the breaks in the vegetation as well, where there's a difference between layers of vegetation. That's helpful. You don't need to draw all the trees in, but just general shapes of either prominent trees or clumps of trees, prominent shapes of clumps of trees. That will help you out later. You're focusing on shapes and not subjects. So pay less attention to the fact that there are individual trees there or individual rocks, and start paying more attention to shapes and shadows and the shapes of shadows as well. Okay, and then moving on to this layer, we really lose a lot. Can't see any, here's a little detail, but very little otherwise. And so that's a useful guideline. I'll put in those areas of detail that I do have, including this area at the top. But then the rest will just be very light because this is meant to be subtle. And then last but not least, these last areas in the background, which are much, much less detailed. I'll leave them light, but I'll just clarify the shapes. You can imagine when you are going into this with watercolor, all of these areas back here should be equally as indiscernible as they are now. And so when I paint in, I'm going to be doing a bunch of loose glazing, just washes, layer after layer of transparent watercolor to build up the sort of transparency that we're seeing here, the haziness that we're seeing here. And so I don't need as many guidelines in there as I do in the foreground elements, where there's a rich amount of diversity of colors and shapes going on. Back here, it all just sort of fades a little bit, and so I can use that to my advantage. And there you pretty much have it. So now the last thing I'm going to do is just reinforce even further some of these edges, some of these lines we've created, just to give myself more clarity. So I'll just make a couple of them darker and more prominent wherever I see intense contrasts. So for example, this dark, dark, dark here against this lighter area here. So right there. And then I've done a pretty good job here already, but another one is right there, that dark shape against this lighter one here. Perhaps a little bit there where that lighter vegetation meets the darker vegetation, just reinforce that, etc. So you can just sort of start adding in more detail, more clarity as you go. But then the other thing is, you have to remember, this isn't meant to be a full-on drawing. This isn't going to be something that's going to be finished as a drawing. I'm using it intentionally as a foundation for watercolor painting. So I have to always be thinking what will be useful for watercolors. And overshading or making too many dark marks is going to be difficult for the watercolors. It'll just show through in the final result, and if I don't want that, then I shouldn't be doing so much of it. So as long as I've created the necessary foundation for myself, then I'm good to go and I can start the watercolors. Practicing drawing as a foundation for your paintings is an important skill towards mastering watercolor. Even loose pencil sketches can go a long way towards helping you be more confident with your paintings. If you enjoyed this demonstration, please like this video and subscribe to The Foster's YouTube channel. Visit www.thefoster.org for more videos tackling different watercolor subjects, and be inspired by artist explorer Tony Foster's incredible artwork. Thank you for watching.